So the Pharisees ask Jesus a question about divorce. Jesus answers with a question. And then they finally respond back to him and tell him what Moses said in the law. And what they tell Jesus is, Moses told us that we could give our wives a certificate of divorce and send her away. Now, the only passage they can be referring to in the writings of Moses would be in Deuteronomy chapter 24, verses 1 through 4. Now, I want to read this passage for us and keep in mind the issue at hand. Can a man divorce his wife for any and every reason? Does this passage support that? Let's look. So Deuteronomy 24, verses 1 through 4. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house, she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce and gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So what happens here, the situation that's being described, is a man gets married. He finds something indecent about his wife. He writes her a certificate of divorce, sends her away. They get divorced. She remarries. That remarriage ends through either divorce or death. And what God says is that first husband is not allowed to marry her again. That first husband is not allowed to marry her again. So here's four things that this passage is teaching. Number one, it's saying that you're not allowed to remarry your ex-wife if she has remarried since her marriage to you. Okay? You're not allowed to marry her. If you were her first marriage, you're not allowed to be her third marriage. The second thing this teaches is that a remarriage results in defilement of the person who is remarrying. So look at what verse 4 says. It says, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. And that's referring to her second marriage. Thirdly, it teaches that if a man were to remarry his ex-wife after she had been married to someone else after him, it would result in defilement of the land. Her remarriage would have resulted in her defilement personally. Remarrying her would result in defilement of the land. And I just want to add one more thing before we move on from this passage. It's going to come up later in our series here as an application, but the second marriage is in fact a marriage. It's not somehow less than a first marriage. It's not somehow like a second rate or second class marriage. It does result in defilement, as the passage says, but nonetheless, it's still fully a marriage, and the honor, the expectations, the obligations are all still attached to that second marriage, and so it's not to be seen less seriously than a first marriage. It's to be treated just as seriously, with just as respectfully, just as honorably as a first marriage. And we'll come back to this point later in the sermon or next week in the sermon, but keep that in mind, that second marriage, it's a marriage. It's a marriage. What this passage does not teach is the Hillelian school of thought that a man may divorce his wife for any and every reason. That was very absent in the mind of Moses when he wrote Deuteronomy 24. At least I think it's that clear. What it specifically says, Moses says, is that a man, if he marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her. So indecency is the reason that the man divorces his wife. Now, what does the word here in Hebrew indecent mean? Well, the word means to show the nakedness of. It means that something that is properly covered up and concealed is revealed and is available for anyone and all to see. And it's a very improper thing when something that's supposed to be covered up, something that's supposed to be concealed, not seen by everyone, is seen by everyone. A great modern day example is the immodest way that a woman can dress when she's showing parts of her body that should not be out for everyone to see, but in fact should be covered up because it's proper for those parts of her body to be covered up. Okay, that might be a modern day example. So to show the nakedness of most certainly alludes to things that are sexually disgraceful in nature. That would include things like adultery, but not by any means be limited to adultery. Now, not only would it be a broad term covering things more than adultery, but the word actually is used about obscene behaviors that aren't sexual in nature. So in the previous chapter, Deuteronomy chapter 23, listen to what it says in verses 12 through 14. Designate a place outside the camp where you can go to relieve yourselves. As part of your equipment, have something to dig with, and when you relieve yourself, dig a hole and cover up your excrement. For the Lord your God moves about in your camp to protect you and to deliver your enemies to you. Your camp must be holy, so that he will not, that is the Lord, will not see among you anything indecent and turn away from you. And indecent there is in reference to human excrement. It was supposed to be outside the camp and covered up. But if it wasn't covered up, if it was out there to be seen by anyone passing by, that's a very indecent and offensive and obscene thing that is not supposed to happen in the camp of the Israelites. So there must be a clear case, according to Moses, of indecency for an Israelite to divorce his wife. And if there wasn't, then he wasn't allowed to divorce her. The Pharisees, in speaking to Jesus, may very well have been of the Hillelian school of thought that any and all reasons for divorce were legitimate, but they most certainly couldn't base it on this passage from Moses here in Deuteronomy 24. And we can't either.